We were 5 days from quarter close, 3 weeks from a federal compliance audit, and finalizing the renewal of a $22 million government contract. In that kind of week, sleep becomes optional. Apparently, so does pay. I had logged 87 hours in 6 days. No performance bonus. Just what leadership like to call executive expectations. By Sunday night, my stomach was cramping from too much coffee and not enough food. My hair had fallen out of its neat twist hours ago. I was still reviewing reconciliation data when Victor Halstead walked in. If you've ever had a week where your body clock gave up before your workload did, you probably know this feeling. And before I tell you what Victor said next, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now if you're still here with me? Drop your lucky number in the comments. Perhaps I need all the luck for what happens next. Let me introduce Victor to you briefly. He is our Regional Operations Director, the public face of the division, the man who briefs the board and speaks confidently about operational discipline. He oversees strategy. I oversee compliance reality. As Senior Operations Compliance Manager, I built the internal reporting controls that keep our federal contracts intact. My job is to make sure we don't violate labor laws, misclassify hours, or lose eligibility during audits. His job is to make sure the numbers look strong when investors ask questions. He stopped beside my desk. "If you feel that a 90-hour workweek is unfair," he said calmly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, "perhaps leadership isn't for you." Not angry, not shouting, just dismissive. The implication hung there: exhaustion equals weakness. I didn't respond. I didn't defend myself. I simply glanced at the time log still open on my screen, rows of login timestamps stretching past midnight, bleeding into dawn, 87 hours, 0 overtime, 0 acknowledgement. Victor adjusted his jacket and walked away as if he'd just motivated a team. I waited until he disappeared down the hall. Then, I opened a new window on my laptop, and I began downloading every login record tied to my name. What follows is a blend of factual narrative and fictional elements, aided by artificial intelligence to highlight the core humanistic message. Choose what resonates with you from this story. And if it doesn't resonate with you right now, that's okay. Take care of yourself, conserve your energy, and we'll meet again when the time is right. A policy was introduced without any meeting, without HR letterhead, without legal review, just an email from Victor at 6:42 a.m. labeled Crisis Leadership Directive. It sounded temporary. It wasn't salary employees. He wrote, "We're not eligible for overtime under current operational demands. Weekend availability was mandatory. Slack response time 10 minutes, regardless of hour." He closed with, "This is what leadership looks like." There was no HR attachment, no compliance reference, just his signature, that morning. I reread my job classification. I know the difference between exempt status and exploitation. I also know when something is being rewritten by ego instead of law. So I began collecting facts: VPN login logs, badge entry scans, server timestamps, payroll statements. Data doesn't argue, it records. Victor escalated in quieter ways. My mid-year performance rating dropped from exceeds expectations to needs development, under comments. He wrote attitude instability during high-pressure cycles. I had worked 87 hours the week before. Apparently, fatigue was now a personality flaw. When I asked, in writing, how the directive aligned with wage compliance standards, he replied within 4 minutes, "Leadership doesn't clock hours." I archived the email 4 months earlier. HR had flagged overtime exposure risks in an internal memo. I found it buried in my inbox. Victor had responded with one line, "We're not paying for fatigue." That was when I understood this wasn't crisis management. It was liability. The shift didn't happen overnight. It happened in calendar invites. 2 days after I emailed Victor asking how the Crisis Leadership Directive aligned with overtime classification rules. I was quietly removed from the largest reporting integration project in our division. No explanation. My name simply disappeared from the attendee list. An hour later, my access to the shared financial dashboard was downgraded from editor to view only. By afternoon, I received a revised performance note. Energy concerns during high-pressure cycles. Energy concerns. I had logged 87 hours the week before. I didn't confront him in the hallway. I didn't raise my voice in a meeting. Instead, I did what compliance professionals do. I documented. After every meeting, I sent a recap email summarizing what was discussed, who reassigned my responsibilities, and which permissions had been modified. I referenced dates, times, system changes. I asked neutral questions. Please confirm this reflects your directive. Kindly clarify the business justification. Victor responded once. Late at night. Document whatever makes you feel secure. It wasn't anger. It was dismissal. So I documented everything. I saved server access logs showing when my permissions were altered. I preserved screenshots of project assignments before and after my removal. I archived Slack messages where colleagues were instructed to route compliance questions around me. Every file was timestamped and backed up to an external drive. On the surface, I remained calm. I attended meetings. I met deadlines. I avoided emotional language. Cold data is harder to discredit than frustration. Then I scheduled a confidential consultation with a labor attorney. I brought printed logs, payroll statements, performance reviews, and Victor's emails. He read quietly for 20 minutes. When he finally looked up, he said, "There are clear indicators of retaliation." He didn't tell me to file immediately. He told me to stay controlled, to keep gathering evidence, to avoid giving them a reason to claim misconduct. So I returned to work the next morning exactly as before. No complaint filed, no envelope delivered, just records accumulating. Monday morning arrived without drama. The systems were stable for once. The quarter still hung over us, heavy and unfinished, but the office was unusually quiet. I arrived early, placed a thick manila envelope in the center of Victor Halstead's desk, and returned to my own office before anyone noticed. No note, no warning, no threat. At 8:12 a.m., Victor walked in. I watched from the glass wall of my office as he loosened his jacket, glanced at the envelope, and frowned. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand as if it might explain itself, then tore it open. Paper slid across his desk. Inside were numbers, cold ones. 312 hours of unpaid overtime across 4 months. A side-by-side comparison of payroll statements against verified VPN logs, badge scans, and server timestamps. A written analysis outlining violations under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Documented evidence of performance downgrades and access restrictions following my classification inquiry. A formal retaliation complaint. He flipped pages faster as he read. The final page was a cover letter, filed with the U.S. Department of Labor 6 days ago. His posture changed first. Then the color drained from his face. He reached for his phone. "HR," he said sharply when they answered. "What is this?" There was a pause long enough for me to see his jaw tighten. "We were notified last week," HR replied, loud enough that I could hear through the speaker from across the hall. Silence. Victor lowered the phone slowly, as if sudden movement might make it worse. He scanned the document again, this time more carefully, landing on the timestamps, the preserved emails, the internal warning from 4 months earlier about overtime exposure risk. He hadn't noticed that memo then. He noticed it now. 10 minutes later, a company-wide legal notice went out instructing managers to preserve all payroll records, access logs, and internal communications related to scheduling and classification. The Department of Labor had already issued a records preservation request. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was an investigation. What do you think happens next to Victor if you believe he's about to spiral into full panic mode? Drop a 1 in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think. It keeps stories like this alive and helps others see they're not alone. Panic did not look dramatic on Victor Halstead. It looked procedural. It looked like back-to-back calendar invites and doors closing too quickly. By Monday afternoon, he requested a private meeting with me. "We may have overextended expectations," Victor began, forcing calm into his voice. This can still be handled internally. He slid a document across the table, a retroactive discretionary bonus, substantial enough to feel corrective, structured carefully to avoid admitting wrongdoing. I didn't reach for it. This doesn't erase a filed complaint, I said evenly. Victor pivoted. There's a director track opening next quarter. I can recommend you. I gave no reaction. He leaned back, lowered his voice. We could pursue a mutual resolution, quietly, within hours. Outside counsel joined a closed-door call with Victor and HR. I wasn't in the room, but I later learned the attorney was blunt. You cannot negotiate retaliation after filing. Any attempt to pressure withdrawal increases liability. Victor's composure thinned. I'm trying to limit exposure. Limit it by preserving records. Counsel replied, not by bargaining, despite the warning. At 9:37 p.m., Victor sent me an email. If you're willing to withdraw the complaint, we can reach an agreement beneficial to both sides. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded the email to my attorney and added it to the Department of Labor file. The next morning, Victor authorized HR to draft a non-disclosure agreement. Broad language, confidentiality clauses, no admission of fault. HR hesitated. This could be interpreted as coercion, one manager warned. Victor insisted. What he did not know was that the complaint had already widened. 2 additional employees had submitted written confirmations of consistent 80-hour workweeks without overtime compensation. Their VPN and badge records aligned precisely with the documentation I had preserved. By Wednesday, this was no longer about one compliance manager. It was about systemic exposure, and Victor was no longer controlling the narrative. The email from the Department of Labor arrived at 8:16 a.m. on Wednesday. And this time, it wasn't subtle. The subject line read, Records Preservation and Production Request. The investigation had moved from acknowledgement to demand. They requested 3 years of payroll records, complete login histories tied to my credentials, internal leadership communications related to scheduling, classification, and performance evaluations. The language was precise, federal, and unambiguous. For the first time, the system I had built began turning in my direction, but not against me. It was turning against the people who had ignored it. By noon, the board had been notified. Legal insisted they had to be. The company's exposure was no longer theoretical. It was documented. Victor attempted control during the emergency call. She exaggerated. He said, These are selective timestamps. Crisis weeks distort averages. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Our compliance officer shared his screen. He had pulled independent back-end verification directly from the server archive. 1,142 verified login entries tied to Ms. Gasiak. Cole's credentials, he said calmly, cross-referenced with badge access and system activity. The data aligns. Silence followed. Victor shifted again. Login activity doesn't equal compensable work. The compliance officer didn't blink. Internal communications indicate directive-based expectations outside standard hours. The words directive-based expectations echoed longer than they should have. Legal interjected. We must comply fully. Failure to produce complete records could escalate penalties. What unsettled Victor most wasn't the volume of documentation. It was the pattern. The timestamps weren't random late nights. They were structured, repeated, predictable. By late afternoon, another notice circulated internally. The audit scope had expanded beyond my individual classification. The Department of Labor was requesting payroll and scheduling data for the entire operations division. This was no longer a dispute about one employee's workload. It was a systemic review. I sat at my desk watching emails multiply across executive inboxes. For months, the system had been used to measure productivity. Now it was measuring accountability, and it wasn't blinking. The tone shifted the moment the board called for an internal hearing. What had started as a personnel issue was now labeled risk review. When that phrase appears on a calendar invite, power quietly changes direction. I was asked to attend as a factual witness. Victor was summoned to respond. The room felt colder than usual. Though no one raised their voice, the chair opened directly. "Did you instruct unpaid overtime?" Victor adjusted his cufflinks, a habit I had come to recognize as a stall. "We encouraged flexibility during crisis periods. Salaried leadership roles often require additional commitment." That was not the question. Another board member replied, "Did you instruct unpaid overtime?" He pivoted. "We never required anything outside industry norms." I watched the phrasing tighten around him. Company counsel then presented a preliminary risk assessment based on current documentation. Projected exposure exceeds $700,000 in back wages and liquidated damages. That estimate does not include potential civil penalties if retaliation is substantiated. 700,000. The number settled over the table with more weight than any accusation. Victor leaned forward. "This assumes those hours are compensable. Logan activity does not automatically qualify as payable time." Counsel responded calmly. Directive-based communications outside standard hours significantly weaken that argument. Silence followed again. The compliance officer spoke next. Referencing the expanded audit scope, the Department of Labor has widened its request to include the entire operations division. This indicates a systemic review, not an isolated complaint. That was the moment the board members stopped looking at me and started looking at Victor. One of them asked quietly, "Were you previously advised about overtime exposure risks?" Victor hesitated half a second too long. The final update arrived before the meeting adjourned. Legal had just been notified that our federal contract had been placed under enhanced compliance monitoring, pending investigation results. That meant quarterly reporting scrutiny, additional documentation, potential eligibility review. This was no longer about fatigue or attitude. It was about contract survival, and for the first time. Victor wasn't directing the conversation. He was answering to it. The findings arrived on a Thursday afternoon, not with drama, but with finality. The letter from the Department of Labor was 12 pages long, precise and methodical, the kind of document that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to. They confirmed overtime misclassification. They confirmed record-keeping violations. They confirmed evidence consistent with retaliation following my written inquiry about wage compliance. Each conclusion referenced timestamps, payroll discrepancies, preserved emails, and internal directives. It wasn't emotional, it was documented. The total estimated liability, $684,000 in back wages and liquidated damages. Reading that number felt different from hearing projections in a boardroom. This wasn't risk anymore, it was determination. The company was ordered to compensate affected employees. Not just me. Policies governing classification, overtime tracking, and after-hours directives were mandated for revision. Mandatory training on wage compliance would be implemented across operations leadership. External monitoring would continue for a defined period. Victor was placed on administrative leave pending internal review. The announcement went out in carefully neutral language. Leadership reassignment during compliance restructuring. No one used the word suspended. No one needed to. I remained at my desk when the memo circulated. Colleagues avoided eye contact at first, then slowly began stopping by. Some thanked me quietly. Others just nodded, as if acknowledging something long overdue. What struck me most was how calm the outcome felt. There were no shouting matches, no dramatic exits, just consequences unfolding in measured sequence. Then came the internal compliance review. Legal had initiated a parallel examination of leadership communications predating my complaint. Archived correspondence revealed that 4 months earlier, HR had issued a written advisory outlining overtime exposure risks tied to extended hour directives. Victor had replied in one sentence, "We're not paying for fatigue." That message, once dismissive, now carried evidentiary weight. The board was notified immediately. By the end of the week, it was clear the investigation had expanded beyond regulatory findings into leadership accountability. The system I had built to protect the company had done exactly that. It had protected the rules. And this time, the rules applied to everyone. Collapse did not arrive in a single announcement. It unfolded in memos, in closed-door meetings, in the quiet recalibration of authority. 3 days after the Department of Labor findings were finalized, the board requested Victor's resignation. The language was careful, voluntary separation in light of compliance restructuring. There was no severance package, no extended transition period. His badge access was disabled by the end of the day. The internal email that followed used a familiar corporate phrase, leadership transition. It thanked him for his contributions and wished him success in future endeavors. No mention of investigations, no mention of liability, just sanitized closure. But inside the building, everyone understood. 2 additional managers in operations were placed under review for enforcing extended hour directives without proper classification analysis. Their inboxes were preserved, their calendars audited. The culture of crisis commitment was suddenly being translated into legal terminology. As for me, payroll adjustments were processed within 10 business days, full back pay for documented overtime, liquidated damages as determined by the Department of Labor, a formal letter confirming corrected classification and restored performance rating. It was thorough, procedural, and almost anticlimactic. I deposited the check without ceremony. What surprised people was my timing. 2 weeks before the final findings were issued, I had quietly accepted an offer from a competing firm, director of compliance. National oversight, salary increased by 38%. I had signed the contract contingent on regulatory resolution. When the findings became official, so did my transition. I gave notice the following Monday. HR asked if I was leaving because of the investigation. No, I said calmly. I'm leaving because compliance should never be reactive. On my last day. I packed slowly. No applause, no farewell party. Just a handshake from legal and a nod from the compliance officer who had verified the logs. Victor's office was already empty. Systems were still running. Reports still generating. The federal contract remained under enhanced monitoring, but intact. Power hadn't exploded. It had shifted. And in that shift, accountability had quietly replaced ego. Justice rarely feels dramatic when it finally arrives. It feels structured, documented, and steady. During my exit interview, HR asked the question everyone had been circling for weeks. Was this about burnout? I shook my head. I didn't file because I was tired. I said calmly, I filed because it was illegal. There was no anger in my voice, just clarity. In the months that followed, the company implemented formal revisions to overtime classification standards. Every salaried role was reevaluated against federal criteria. After-hours directives now required documented justification. An anonymous reporting channel was established for wage and compliance concerns. Mandatory FLSA training became part of leadership onboarding. Not optional, not seasonal, required. The systems I had designed were strengthened, not dismantled. Ironically, they were now used exactly as intended. Victor left the industry quietly. For 18 months, his name appeared only in regulatory documentation tied to the investigation findings, while the internal emails had softened the language. Federal records did not. His decisions were preserved in case summaries and compliance reviews. Reputation, once leveraged for authority, had been reduced to footnotes in legal analysis. I didn't celebrate that outcome. I didn't need to. What mattered was that the rules applied evenly again, that employees no longer felt compelled to choose between exhaustion and security, that leadership language could no longer override statutory law. Looking back, the envelope was never an act of revenge. It was an act of alignment. The envelope did not destroy Victor. His disregard for labor law did. And when systems are allowed to function as designed, they do not scream. They simply correct. What this experience taught me wasn't about winning. It was about understanding the difference between exhaustion and exploitation. I had convinced myself that being strong meant absorbing pressure without complaint. It doesn't. Strength is knowing the law, documenting the facts, and choosing dignity over silence. The emotional shift didn't happen the day the findings were released. It happened the moment I realized I didn't owe anyone my health in exchange for approval. There's a practical lesson here, too. Keep records, save emails, understand your classification. Policies sound powerful until they meet documentation. And emotionally, remember this calm action is often more effective than loud resistance. You don't have to explode to create change. You just have to be precise. If you were in that situation, what would you do? Would you keep working and hope it improves? Or would you protect your boundaries early? I'm genuinely curious, where are you listening from right now? Different states, different countries, but the same questions about fairness. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing. One subscription helps this message reach someone who might still believe overwork is the only option. A like or a share might give someone the courage to document instead of endure. When you comment, you're not just reacting, you're helping build a space where accountability matters. And sometimes, that quiet action is exactly what changes someone else's story. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.